Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. Legacy media continue to prepare Western audiences for a military conflict in Ukraine. Another war of choice? Also, the United States doesn't export much these days, maybe except for so-called values. Are those values attractive anymore? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is a historian, analyst, and author of the book, Arise Rossiya, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And in Plymouth, we have Patrick Henningsen. He is the editor and founder of the 21st Century Wire.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Marcus in London. I pride myself on this program to keeping a microscopic eye on what's going on in Ukraine, because when you look at what I just say is this outright propaganda in Western media about upcoming war in Ukraine. Of course, Russia is deemed the aggressor, but the audiences are being prepared for what the West wants to see happen when it comes to Ukraine. I don't think NATO wants to fight Russia. I don't think the United States wants to fight Russia, but they certainly are intrigued by the idea that Ukraine may fight Russia, which we all know what the result would be, and that is a planned result. Go ahead, Marcus.
I am of the view that the world is beginning to reach a climax regarding Ukraine, because America's goading of Russia has served a purpose, specifically by Washington having provocatively increased its naval presence in the Black Sea. This has inevitably brought about a response from Russia, and that has provided the Americans with a pretext to increase not only NATO's presence in the Baltic and in Eastern Europe, but it has also enabled the Americans to increase their military and economic assistance to Ukraine. So the Americans and the British are now supplying Ukraine with sophisticated weaponry. At the same time, the International Monetary Fund, which of course is a weapon of both Washington and London, has agreed to release funds for Ukraine. So we can see that a very dangerous picture is emerging, and the Americans and the British are now in a position to cement their position in Ukraine.
But Marcus, what you're saying is that they're trying to provoke a response. This is the intention.
Yes, they are trying to provoke a response, but I think primarily they are looking to enhance their position in Ukraine. But that carries a lot of risks. Indeed, it is fraught with risks, because whilst America does not and will not go to war with Russia over Ukraine, there is, of course, a risk of an accidental war. And for NATO, Ukraine is necessary to encircling Russia on its western border, but Ukraine is not necessary to the Western military bloc's security. However, Ukraine is vital to Russian national security. And if circumstances compel it to, Russia will go to war over Ukraine. And if that means going to war with America over Ukraine, it will do so, because, as I said, Ukraine is absolutely crucial to Russian national security. If the Russians were sending their naval vessels to the Gulf of Mexico, you would see America take a very, very clinical response. It is no different for Russia in the Black Sea.
But it's very interesting, Patrick. Ukraine is also necessary for NATO because Ukraine gives NATO a reason to exist, okay? Because they claim NATO's position is that it's a defensive alliance and that it projects stability. However, arming ever more sophisticated weapons to Kiev is destabilizing. It's destabilizing to the conflict that is going on inside of Ukraine. We need to remind our viewers this is an intra-Ukraine conflict that I believe the West wants Russia to be involved in. Russia has always said this is an internal conflict, the Donbass, of course, but if the Donbass is attacked, which would basically be a form of ethnic cleansing of the Donbass, Russia's said this is a red line here. So again, adding all the elements for a possible military action. And as we just heard Marcus say, this could happen by accident. But I have a feeling a lot of people in Washington and London would love to see an accident. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, absolutely. The other problem is Ukraine's become a kind of dumping market for corporate welfare in the United States. That's really what military aid is at the end of the day. They're dumping various products or discontinued products or whatever. And now we've got the issue of drones. And so as the technology of military advances, and you have this sort of the revolution in military affairs with drones, for instance, this is kind of problematic because of the proximity between Russia and the Ukraine being next door neighbors. So it does increase the chances of all sorts of problems, new problems that are emerging that sometimes take years to get ironed out with the introduction of new technology. Turkey has also been supplying them with arms and drones. Actually, the first drones, I think, supplied to the Ukraine from Turkey, not the U.S. But that day might not be too far off, Peter, when the U.S. is sending Reaper drones or other UAVs, advanced UAVs. The problem is Ukraine's in this cycle of dependency. So the U.S. and the West have captured them politically. They've captured them now economically in the cycle of aid dependency. And this aid comes in various forms. Okay, once you get in that cycle, you become you become colonized by the West. I mean, and next thing will be if there's a significant intelligence presence or listening stations based in the Ukraine, then the control over the Ukraine's political bodies becomes a kind of a foreign affair. Australia had fallen into that trap years ago during the Cold War. That's one example. Many countries actually fell into that trap during the Cold War period, and they're still in that cycle all these years later. So, I mean, I see this as a kind of a colonization, a long-term colonization of the Ukraine.
Patrick, I agree with that fundamental premise here. But it also can turn into a wag the dog situation as well, because that dependency is now they're all in so many different levels. All we need to do is to seal the deal is lob a few more, or have a few more drones fly over the Donbass and create an incident. I mean, because you've already made a commitment. It could be very difficult to withdraw. I mean, we already have the historical example of August 2008 with Saakashvili and South Ossetia, okay? It's going to be, and because if the U.S. doesn't stand by its commitments, then it will face a disgrace. Okay?
The military side, the military side could be over very quickly.
Oh, yes.
This is a political situation more than anything. And I'm sure the Ukrainians would like nothing more than to see the Minsk peace process realized. But a lot of interference continues to happen constantly at every single turn by the U.S. or by whatever leader it had installed, Poroshenko. And now they seem to have a tremendous amount of influence and sway over the current president, Zelensky.
Let's talk about Zelensky. Marcus, over the last couple of days, Zelensky has been making claims, very public claims, that there is a planned coup against his government here. Is this another psych op here, or is he in trouble? Because he's lost his majority in the parliament. Many of his close associates have turned on him. A major opposition figure is basically being held under house arrest. He's attacked independent media. He's in trouble here. But I mean, is this part of the psych op here of tensions growing, or is he sending a message to Washington and London saying, "Let's go"? Go ahead.
For nearly 8 years now, Ukraine has been in the West's sphere of influence. So therefore, it follows that Zelensky came to power as a result of his masters in Washington, London, and Brussels having decided that he was the person they wanted to be in power in Kiev. Therefore, he is part and parcel of providing a pretext for Ukraine to be eventually brought in to NATO, for NATO to increase its presence in the Baltic, in Eastern Europe, and also in the Black Sea region. That is why Zelensky is making these completely and utterly unsubstantiated claims. If he has evidence that a foreign government is planning a coup in his country, then go to the United Nations and present your findings there. That is why the United Nations, or that is one of the reasons why the United Nations was established in the first place. But of course, there is no evidence to suggest that Moscow or any other foreign government in the world is attempting a coup. But the reason he made the allegation is to give NATO a pretext to keep on building up its presence on the Russian border.
Yeah, but the irony is here, Patrick, is that there was a coup in 2014 by foreign governments against the duly elected president at the time. I mean, it's really quite rich here talking about a foreign meddling in your domestic politics when he is the result of it. Go ahead, Patrick.
I can't imagine where they're getting their intelligence from. I can't imagine. So he's privy to these special briefings, and U.S. intelligence will probably have plenty of files and dossiers to open up on the desk of President Zelensky to show him how under threat he is from Moscow. It's not in Moscow's interest to be overthrowing governments, especially in the Ukraine, and doing it in a sort of public view. But this narrative plays over so well and constantly in the West. So this is very much a battle of narratives. And I might add that this is a very complex situation, because not only do you have Eastern Ukraine, but you also have the issue of Crimea, and they're always keeping that on the burner in Washington as a sort of retaliation pretext. And Europe's kind of almost gotten past Crimea by now, but Washington will just keep dangling it around like they do with Cuba, for instance, constantly and forever. But the reality there is they'll never contextualize what happened with Crimea in any historical context, and they won't call out how things actually unfolded there when that process happened in 2014. So.
It's very interesting. Let me finish off with Patrick before we go to the break here. I mean, it's really interesting is that harping on Crimea is and arming Kiev. I mean, this at the end of the day, it's very low cost for the U.S. but it's very important to Russia because it's border security and the security of its sovereignty. So it's a quite cynical game, and Ukraine almost has nothing to do with it per se. 15 seconds, Patrick. Go ahead.
Yeah, and not only that, they're constantly championing in the West oblasts and independence movements and ethno-independence and so forth. And this is a perfect example, Crimea, of something that normally they would get behind in any other part of the world. But in this case, because of the geopolitical implications, they won't.
Only friends get self-determination. That's what we learn here. All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. This is the home edition. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, let's go back to Patrick. Patrick, the U.S. the Biden administration is sponsoring a democracy conference on December 10th and 11th. It's all going to be virtual. I think 110 countries have been invited. We can look at the list. Okay, there's some interesting omissions, and then there's some interesting additions, which one could question, and it puts the entire idea of democracy into doubt in the first place. However, this is an interesting cudgel here. I mean, it seems to me that the Washington consensus is very, very nervous. It needs to convince itself that still leading the world in terms of democracy is if that is what is driving the world here. This whole narrative of democracy versus autocracy falls apart like a house of cards. It's laughable in the 21st century. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's these sort of confabs are just endless, and I thought that they would die off at some point in the past, but no, they're going to expand this sort of thing, and it's even more laughable the fact that these are all being done remotely by Zoom, for instance. So they're just kind of these digital confabs, ultimately very meaningless in terms of what's going on the ground, but in terms of showing the public what direction the social agenda is being steered towards. Then in that case, it is kind of significant. It is important. And so this idea of social justice, this idea of this sort of cultural agenda is very much baked into the UN sustainability goals. And all of these countries have bought into those talking points and those objectives. And so in the World Economic Forum as well, all these things, social justice, trans agenda and inclusion and equity, and all of these things are baked in to the World Economic Forum's literature and what they're promoting, and also the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So it's not something that's just a feature or an ornament. No, it is a central part of what's driving this agenda. So I think whether it's through climate change, and you see this at the G7 as well, everything is gearing towards that. So they're trying to inject this kind of globalized social agenda. You can read this as a direct attack on the traditional family structure, to religious institutions, and all of the sort of traditional features that have created modern nation states that have brought society and the world to this point in history. This is in the process of being undone, I think, through all these confabs.
Well, I think another thing that's being undone, I'll go back to Marcus in London here, is that this is a replacement for what we understand as international law, and a replacement of the United Nations in the founding charter. We've seen this repeatedly. This is actually not a new idea. John McCain, the late John McCain, wanted to have this a League of Democracies, is basically the Washington Consensus superseding international law in the United Nations. And we see this continuing right here. And Patrick brought up a very, very good point, is that this is all, it has actually very little to do with democracy. I mean, there's 500 people being held in Washington jails because of the riot on January 6th. What about their rights? Okay, it's a bit rich to be talking about human rights when we have a situation like that. But what it is that, again, it's just the Washington Consensus with its neoliberal ideology trying to replace institutions, because those institutions are just inconvenient for them. Go ahead.
In light of the societal changes, the diabolical societal changes occurring in America, for Washington to keep on preaching to the rest of the world about democracy amounts to simply inversion. Because through his physical ailments, I believe that Joe Biden symbolizes how America is the sick man of the world. Because there was a time when Americans, in the context of at home, could claim morality, they could claim democracy, but those days are long gone, because firstly, there is very little freedom of speech left in America today as a result of neoliberalism, which manifests itself today through woke, and of course woke very much includes BLM. There is very little freedom of speech in the workplace in America, in schools, in colleges, in universities, and also in sports. We hear how neoliberals and woke champion tolerance, and they champion diversity. They are some of the most intolerant people you will come across. These people loathe diversity. If you do not support their values, and I use the word values in a very loose way, then they will demonstrate to you and to everyone else looking on just how hateful, just how violent, just how poisonous they are. But secondly, in my opinion, what something else which has emerged in America and has also emerged in Britain, and which is worse than the deterioration of freedom of speech in America, is the emergence of the most wicked, the most abhorrent form of sexual depravity. And that is pedophiles rebranding themselves in American society in a way to normalize pedophilia. So I am referring to a term which has arisen called minor attracted persons. That is a front for pedophilia. Minor attracted persons has a presence, in fact, is pervasive on social media. There have been numerous investigations which have exposed that. Joe Biden thought it right to refer to Kyle Rittenhouse as a white supremacist, but he has not thought it right to intervene and to utterly condemn the emergence of minor attracted persons. That is why I say that America is the sick man of the world. And Joe Biden, through his physical ailments, symbolizes that.
You know, it's interesting, Patrick, this going back to this democracy confab that's coming up. I mean, a country like Hungary, which is a member of the European Union, and under European Union bylaws, you cannot be anything but a democracy to be part of the European Union. It is a member of the United Nations, but it is being punished. It's not invited there because the Washington Consensus and its ideology abhor what the democratic wishes of the people in Hungary support, okay? You can like Prime Minister Erdogan or not, but I mean, he was put there by the people that voted, okay? Again, this is a very pernicious way of understanding democracy, and it has a whole lot to do about the values that we're talking about in this program, the lack of values, okay? I mean, it's either our way or the highway, and I think that's already been said by both of you on this program. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, probably the issue that in terms of Hungary, the issue that's drawn the ire of Europe and the West is the issue of immigration, and Hungary's Orban's stance towards that, which isn't a lot different actually if you look at it from a lot of other European countries, but he's kind of been singled out. And also, I think because he's more conservative, he's championing family values, he's championing Hungarian sovereignty, independence, culture, and so forth, traditional culture. And so this goes absolutely against the trend that Western Europe is heading very aggressively towards, that the United States is heading very aggressively towards. And if you look at this, I think the big advocates for things like open borders and things like the sort of the general depravity of culture and the evisceration of traditional families and values, transnational corporate cartels are some of the biggest beneficiaries of each and every one of these. So you'll see they're also very much on the woke left as well. So because for their bottom line, that children are a massive economic pool for them to draw from now. There's a massive consumer group that wasn't there before, and in terms of cheap labor coming in or destabilizing traditional family values, these are all things that benefit in the short term anyway, the corporate agenda and the profit bottom lines of many of these companies. So you'll find them backing these candidates who are pushing all of this agenda, and you'll find them generally running these ad campaigns and marketing social justice ad campaigns. They have nothing to do really with selling the actual product, but everything to do with inculcating this generation with whatever that sort of idealized or seem to be idealized social justice messages.
Yeah, they're selling an attitude, and a bad attitude at that, I would say. Marcus, it's also interesting the countries that were not invited to the confab. Obviously, China and Russia are not invited. Again, this is a form of some kind of new cultural Cold War. These countries are not invited to polite company here. But it goes in line with what all of us have been saying here, is that, particularly Russia's a conservative country and a proud conservative country. And it's something the people in the Washington Consensus abhor any other choice. No options. There's only one option. It's our option. And if you're not part of it, then you will be silenced, you will be disappeared, you will be canceled here. Again, it's very much of a cultural cudgel. Go ahead, Marcus in London.
Absolutely. neoliberals in America and in Britain and in other parts of the West have appropriated words and terms and have deliberately distorted them in order to fit them into their agenda. So today, in 2021, social justice has lost its proper meaning. Equality has lost its proper meaning. Diversity has lost its proper meaning. Tolerance has lost its proper meaning. These words and terms have been politicized, and they are being used as weapons, and I should add, potent weapons, to silence people in America and in Britain who oppose neoliberalism, who oppose woke, who oppose BLM, but also they serve a purpose in a geostrategic way, and that is Russia is again a great power. Russia is the only country that can limit American global hegemony. And as you said, in cultural terms, in societal terms, Russia is a very conservative country. It was a conservative country, of course, under the Tsars. It was a conservative country under the Bolsheviks, and modern day Russia continues to be a conservative country. It upholds its cultural and spiritual values, and that is what provokes such disdain in Washington and London. So use those words against Russia.
It's a threat. It's a threat against the consensus. All right. I want to thank my guests in London and in Plymouth. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, crosstalk rules.